Picture this scene. Your hometown produces a poor cobbler's son. The neighbors, seeing his misery, give him food and clothes. The local police chief protects him. A judge shields him. That is how he survives. Decades later, that boy becomes the absolute ruler of half the world. Do you think he would come back with gratitude and privilege to shield the land that had raised him? If that man is Joseph Stalin, your answer is no. He didn't bring protection. He brought famine, firing squads, and a systematic campaign of cultural erasure. This is the story of how a man utterly betrayed his own roots and then repaid his homeland in the coldest way imaginable. Stalin had long forgotten that it was his father's wealthy friend who, for years, generously dug into his own pockets, time and again coming to the aid of his abandoned mother, keeping the two of them from starving to death in that ramshackle little house in Gori. He also couldn't remember that it was the local police chief, a soft-hearted Georgian man who repeatedly tipped off young Stalin ahead of the Tsarist authorities' inspections, allowing the boy to slip away. It was a sympathetic judge, feeling for the widow and her fatherless boy, who skillfully maneuvered on the edges of the law and dropped the charges against this problem child time and again. And there was the entire Georgian community of Gori simple mountain folk who, in the family's darkest hour, would bring a block of cheese or slip them a few copper coins, holding up a family about to plunge into the abyss with the simplest acts of kindness. The son of a drunken cobbler, destined to die silently and unnoticed in poverty and chaos, grew up safe only because of this dense web of care that surrounded him from all sides. But what he gave back to his hometown wasn't gratitude, wasn't protection, it was cold exploitation, a bloody purge, and a form of cultural violence designed to rip out the very soul of his homeland. It's a cruelty so ironic, it's nauseating, filling one with a deep, existential chill. After seizing supreme power, Stalin spent his entire life remaking himself into an abstract all-Soviet leader, transcending all ethnicities. He desperately downplayed, almost pathologically and compulsively concealed his Georgian blood, as if it were a stain that had to be scrubbed clean. In public, he spoke a Russian heavily laced with a thick Georgian accent, an accent that, by its very existence, was a mirror cruelly reflecting the past he wanted to bury. But in his totalitarian logic, the Soviet people were the only valid, supreme whole. Any overly distinct ethnic characteristic, especially a national consciousness that could challenge Moscow's central authority or awaken local pride, was a poisonous sprout that needed to be beaten, pruned, and crushed. So, Georgia, under his rule, didn't receive a single shred of special treatment just for being his homeland. Instead, thanks to a twisted, almost sadistic mentality of you must set an example first, it was forced to bear a weight far heavier and more suffocating than many other places. But first, we must establish one crucial historical fact, so we don't fall into the trap of oversimplification. The Stalin era didn't impose a wholesale, forced deportation of the entire Georgian nation, stuffing them into cattle cars and uprooting the whole people, like it did to the Chechens, the Crimean Tatars, or the Volga Germans. No, his rule over his own homeland was more subtle, more calculated, and precisely because of that, far more insidious and terrifying. It was like a slowly tightening net, operating on three interlocking, mutually reinforcing levels: political high-pressure terror, systematic economic plunder, and cultural spiritual castration. Georgia, this ancient land, nestled in the southern foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, had a deep-rooted sense of independence and a brilliant, dazzling national culture dating back to the Tsarist era. Its history stretches back to the kingdoms of Colchis and Iberia, predating the rise of the Grand Duchy of Moscow by nearly 2 millennia. In the cafes and literary salons of Tbilisi, whispers of independence and national revival, like geothermal springs beneath the surface, had never truly cooled. But in the eyes of Stalin, who craved a rigid, monolithic uniformity, this vibrant cultural pulse wasn't a treasure to be proud of. It was a potential source of instability, a ticking time bomb he had to dismantle with cold precision. The economic plunder was the first step, the most direct way of crushing the Georgian people physically. From the late 1920s into the early 1930s, the nationwide frenzy of agricultural collectivization mercilessly rolled over Georgia's lush, green countryside. Parallel to the tragedy known as the Holodomor in Ukraine, armed grain requisition squads, often leather-jacketed, stone-faced NKVD agents, and fanatical urban cadres dispatched from Moscow marched straight into Georgian villages. These villages, rich in grapes, citrus fruits, and corn, were once among the most fertile agricultural regions in all of Transcaucasia. But now, the requisition squads kicked in wooden doors house by house, pointed bayonets and pistols at peasants who had farmed this land for generations, and forcibly dragged out the last sack of cornmeal hidden under the bed, loading even the seeds meant for next spring's planting onto trucks without leaving a single grain behind. All of this, in the official propaganda machine, was packaged as a heroic feat to raise capital for the state's mad drive for industrialization. But strip away that shiny rhetorical coat, and it was naked, almost sadistic state plunder. This directly led to the outbreak of a brutal, widespread famine that tore through rural Georgia in 1932 and 1933. Tens of thousands of Georgian peasants, men, women, and children starved to death in the very fertile valleys famous for their wine and corn. The scenes were unspeakable. Bloated bodies lying next to empty cooking pots, entire villages silent as graveyards, with only stray dogs roaming the streets. And those peasants who tried to hide a small sack of grain, or who simply murmured their discontent to a neighbor in a low voice, were immediately branded with two fatal labels: Kulak Saboteur, or, even more dangerously, Georgian Nationalist. Once that label was applied, the fate awaiting them was either a bullet fired into the back of the head, or a death train clattering thousands of kilometers in a cattle car to a Siberian gulag. Their families suffered with them, branded as kin of an enemy of the people, stripped of their jobs, ration cards, and housing, cast down to the absolute lowest rung of society. But the starving stomach was just the beginning of the suffering. What was to be tormented next was the brain and the memory. Stalin's purge of the Georgian party apparatus, state organs, and intellectual elite was utterly merciless. The thoroughness and brutality of its execution reaching a level of paranoia that bordered on the psychotic. He was terrified of one thing: that native Georgian communist officials, relying on old connections, local prestige, and hometown networks, would form a regional faction that could challenge his absolute personal authority or develop what the party called national deviationism. In the mid to late 1930s, during the nationwide frenzy known as the Great Purge, sunny Georgia, a land famed for its hospitality, saw its party and state apparatus and its intellectuals become the most heavily devastated disaster zone. In the short span of just 2 years, from 1936 to 1938, the Central Committee of the Georgian Communist Party was almost entirely drained of its blood and replaced, like a body having its original blood completely sucked out and refilled with something entirely different. Historical records show that during this period, over 80% of the senior officials of the Georgian Communist Party were purged. Wave after wave of leaders, veteran revolutionaries who had survived the underground struggle, and prominent national intellectuals were quietly taken away in the NKVD's black sedans in the dead of night, and then, as if evaporating from the face of the earth, they simply vanished forever. After a brief, absurdly scripted trial by a troika that sometimes lasted only minutes, or with no trial at all, not even bothering with the performance, they were dragged into a prison basement and executed with a single bullet to the back of the head. Just how brutal was this purge? Let's illustrate with one man's example. Even those old comrades and old friends from Stalin's own early years, doing underground revolutionary work in Georgia, men who had shared a bowl of soup with him, covered for him, even saved his life under the nose of the Tsarist secret police, were doomed to die, as long as his suspicious, dark heart judged them to be even the slightest bit unreliable. Take Mamia Orakelishvili, an old Bolshevik who had printed leaflets alongside the young Stalin in an underground Tbilisi print shop and evaded capture with him. In 1937, he was arrested on the fabricated charge of being an enemy of the people and executed after a trial lasting only minutes. His wife was also arrested and shot, and even their young daughter was sent to an orphanage. Through this method, he sent one cold message to everyone: nobody is untouchable, and no old bond can stand against the needs of my power. In this way, he ensured that the land of Georgia was held tightly and suffocatingly in his own hands and those of his most trusted proxy. And that proxy was another Georgian who brought deep, devastating disaster upon his homeland, Lavrenti Beria. Thus, any tiny sprout of independence was completely uprooted, soil and all, before it could ever break the surface. While the physical annihilation was underway, a simultaneous strangulation of the Georgian national soul was also in progress, a strangulation that was even more insidious and more enduring. Though the Georgian language was not, in theory, formally banned by law that would be too crude, too obvious, Russian was forcibly promoted as the superior, the only pan-Union language of power, education, and modernization. In government documents, courtroom debates, higher education, and all-important public occasions, Russian held an absolute, unchallengeable dominance. Georgia's glorious historical studies especially those concerning its ancient kingdoms, Orthodox Christian heritage, and its unique alphabet, were tightly choked by harsh, multi-layered censorship. Scholars who tried to study Georgia's early Christian architecture or compile a history of Georgian literature found their manuscripts repeatedly sent back, ordered to rewrite from the Soviet perspective or face non-publication. Any literary work, theatrical performance, or song that could be interpreted as promoting the uniqueness of the Georgian nation or a sense of patriotism was immediately denounced, banned, and purged. This was, in fact, a form of forced spiritual amputation, the goal being to violently saw off the memory and pride of an ancient people from their living body. Its ultimate aim was to weaken or even erase Georgians' identity as a distinct nation, dissolving them quietly and completely into the cold, abstract melting pot of the Soviet people, turning them into a pile of faceless, gray matter. Here, we must pause and focus on an unavoidable, dark figure who loomed over his homeland Lavrenti Beria. He was also a Georgian. Born in a poor mountain village in western Georgia, spoke fluent Georgian, and knew every inch of this land and the weakness of every person in it. From the early 1930s, for nearly 2 decades, he was Stalin's incarnation in Georgia, the direct proxy of his power, and the hands-on executor of the Great Purge. Beria's rule in Georgia can only be described as a lawless, terrifying personal history of terror. Using the NKVD's unlimited blade of power, he arbitrarily arrested, tortured, exiled, and executed so-called enemies of the people as casually as crushing ants underfoot. According to later testimony from witnesses and survivors, Beria even personally participated in interrogations, staring at victims with his chilling, soulless eyes before ordering the use of torture. Before he moved his headquarters to Moscow, he first painted the rungs of his power ladder red, layer by layer, right there in Tbilisi, using the blood of his own countrymen. For many Georgians, this added a much deeper, more heartbreaking layer of tragedy. The unspeakable, unimaginable suffering they endured was ultimately delivered directly through the hands of one of their own. So, in summary, the way Stalin treated his fellow Georgians was an undiluted, ice-cold, imperial style of rule. For him, there was no such thing as the bond of a hometown, no such thing as the debt of being raised by a community. Those were just obstacles to be crushed like stones on his path to absolute power. To consolidate his supreme central power and maintain the systemic stability of the entire Soviet Empire, any hint of local distinctiveness or independence, no matter how faint or remote, had to be subjected to indiscriminate, preemptive, and devastating suppression. Georgia, as his homeland, a place anyone would think was most likely to receive shelter, got none at all. Instead, to fulfill the twisted expectation of becoming a model Soviet republic, it was forced to endure even stricter censorship, heavier control, and a far more bone-chilling sense of betrayal than many other regions. Its people, like millions of others across the Soviet Union, lived through the hellish famine of collectivization, the suffocating terror of the Great Purge, and the brutal burden of the Second World War, in which Georgia sacrificed hundreds of thousands of its young men. It is estimated that around 700,000 Georgian soldiers were conscripted during World War II, and nearly half of them never returned to their beautiful valleys and vineyards. Stalin, through his entire life, and through everything he did to his homeland, coldly proved one single, terrible truth to the world. In his world, there was no blood tie to the land, no love for one's native soil, no debt of gratitude to the neighbors who had saved him. There were only 2 things that never changed: an eternal, greedy thirst for ruling power, and a cold, merciless state rationality that would drag the whole world into the abyss to achieve its ends.